Hi friends, welcome to chapter 6 on conformity and group influence. In this brief presentation, we'll cover section 1, which explores norms, conformity, and group influence. In section 2, we'll talk about ostracism and persuasion. And in chapter 3, we'll talk about group influence and decision-making outcomes. So let's go ahead and get started talking about norms, conformity, and group influence. So what is conformity? Essentially, conformity is the process whereby people will change their beliefs, their attitudes, their actions, or even their perceptions to more closely match those held by a group to which they belong or want to belong due to desires related to approval or acceptance. So think about your own life and the groups that you have membership in, and how maybe you've conformed your own beliefs, your opinions, your ideas, actions, behavior, perceptions in order to match the group, uh, primarily because you either wanted to belong to that group, or that you already belong to that group, or that you wanted to maintain a sense of approval by your group member, or even gain acceptance. So, we could look at peer pressure. Teenagers often go through this process of discovering their identity, and they may change different social groups, and they may change what they wear, what they listen to, how they talk, and their behavior. As adults, we do this as well. Think of this educational process. You're getting an education, and you're learning to a certain extent how to conform your thinking to your major or to the discipline that you're pursuing, right? So for me, studying communication for the past 12, 15 years, I've conformed kind of my beliefs, attitudes, actions, perceptions to match that of predominant communication scholarship. So again, you can think of your own life and how you've conformed in a variety of different ways in order to belong to a particular group. So these norms, any group has a set of norms, and norms are essentially the expectations that govern group members' behavior. We also see that norms can govern opinions as it relates to what's right or wrong, good or bad, acceptable, unacceptable, appropriate or inappropriate. Now, we also see that groups can have explicit norms, which usually are formal, clearly written or stated explicit expectations. So, for example, in most college classes and college campuses, we have a zero tolerance of cheating. That is, if you read through the student handbook, the student conduct section, you'll see that the college has clear expectations on, cheating behavior. However, implicit norms are these informal, not so clearly stated or even written implicit expectations, but these implicit norms are still held by many. So, for example, think about reading through the student conduct handbook. There's not going to be a rule related to picking your nose in class, right? However, most people wouldn't necessarily do that because of it would violate some sort of implicit norm. So if you've taken a psychology class, chances are you've stumbled upon Solomon Asch's experiments on conformity. Essentially, what he did was he found that participants who were subjected to group pressure were essentially motivated to inaccurately answer questions. And so the question was, in his clinical trials, which of these three lines is similar to this line, or the same length as this line in the first card? And by looking at that, you and I can probably determine fairly quickly that letter C, the C line, is the same length as this line in the card. Well, when participants were placed in groups, the other group members were instructed to give false answers. So they would say, let's say A is similar to this line. And what he found was that the participant in the end of the sequence, in how people were answering out loud, that 32% of participants went along with incorrect majority answers in the critical trials. Through his studies, through the 12 critical trials, 75% of participants conformed at least once to the group. So even though the group inaccurately answered these questions, majority of the people went along with the group anyways. So this could be explained by two different things. First is the informational influence approach. And this is essentially when someone feels the desires to be right and believes that the group is more informed, right? So, as humans, we want to be right. We don't want to be mistaken. We don't want to be wrong. And because there's one of us and many people in the group, we assume that because there's more people in the group, they must have more knowledge about a particular thing. And so we just go with the group. The other approach is looking at this normative influence. This is the desire to essentially fit in, to gain rewards, or to even avoid punishment, such as social ostracism. So individuals who maybe went along with incorrect answers may have been doing so because they didn't want to go against the majority in the group, because they wanted to fit in, or they didn't want to be embarrassed or stand out or cause any drama. So really interesting to explore Solomon Asch's experiments on conformity. Let's go ahead and take a look at group influence. So group influence in conformity is contingent on agreement by all members. So we see that if everyone agrees, then the chances of us agreeing with the group also increases. Dissent from a group member increases resistance to conform. So if, let's say, one or two people in the group disagree with the prevailing majority, then that essentially punctures this conformity, and conformity decreases. Also, we see that emotional reaction of the majority, such as anger towards unconforming members, may increase anti-conformatory in people. So, if you're trying to get people to conform to your idea and someone is dissenting, instead of getting angry at them or trying to persuade them by punishments or ostracizing them, that's actually going to backfire. And we see this happen all the time around us. So think about the political polarization and the entrenchment that we're experiencing in the nation. And essentially, if you criticize, if you judge, if you argue and get upset about someone from a different political ideology, chances are that's going to make them stand more firm in their beliefs and what their political stances, right? So even though we aren't going to touch it in this class, Foss and Griffith developed a theory called invitational rhetoric, which takes into consideration this perspective, in that in order to foster positive, dialogue, you really have to understand the viewpoints of your audience and allow them to exert some sort of influence over your belief. Because when people feel like they're being heard, they're more likely to also hear someone else's arguments out. And again, that fosters dialogue. We also see moral judgments are vulnerable to group pressure and authority. Based off of the group majority and pressures from the group, individuals may engage in, questionable moral judgments. So you think about, how is it that majority of Germany went along with Hitler to commit genocide, right? How is it that they were able to forego any moral judgment and be okay doing that? So to explore this question a little bit further, we could look at Stanley Milgram's shock experiment, where 65% of participants in his experiments administered what they believed to be 450 volts of dangerous severe shocks to a participant, simply because of someone in perceived authority, like someone in a white lab coat, told them, you have to do this. So here's a quote from Stanley Milgram that reads, ordinary people simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible destructive process. So again, if you've taken a psychology class, chances are you've stumbled upon some of these classics. But if you haven't, I would highly recommend that you just Google or even YouTube some documentaries or even some videos of Stanley Milgram's experiments. And these studies have been replicated multiple times throughout history with similar results, right? So really interesting stuff. So let's take a look at social impact theory. So how is it that we are persuaded by the group or influenced by the group? Well, according to the social impact theory, the amount of influence a person experiences depends on really three conditions. The strength of the source, so power or social status of the source of that message or that influence, right? So we typically are influenced by people who hold higher power or who have higher social status. So the strength of the source. The second is the immediacy of the source. This is the physical or psychological distance between us and the source. So if you just take a look and reflect on your own personal life, chances are you're persuaded by, the people closest to you, family members, close friends, and that type of thing. But you might not be persuaded or influenced so much by a complete stranger, primarily because maybe there is psychological or emotional distance. You don't have that type of relationship with someone. We could also look at the how physical distance plays into this. So we see the events unraveling in Ukraine and Russia, right? Because that is not part of our physical environment or reality. We might not be susceptible to the influence or to persuasion, primarily because of the regional distance or the physical distance involved. So we're influenced primarily based off of individuals who are close to us, both in physical and psychological capacities. The third is the size and number of sources. So the number of individuals within a group. So large groups tend to exert more influence and power over people. So according to the social impact theory, we could look at this diagram. So if we see the strength of the source, so in this depiction, we see that there's multiple sources of, and let's say assume they have high power and social status. Let's say they're very close to the target, and there's a big number of them, and they're all communicating the same thing, exerting that same influence and pressure. That's going to increase the likelihood that the target is going to be influenced into conforming. However, if there is only one source with multiple targets, so you have one source trying to influence all these different targets, then we see that conformity decreases. So let's go ahead and take a look at Burke's theory of identification and how this relates to persuasion and influence. So some of the theoretical assumptions that Kenneth Burke laid forth is, first, identification is fundamental to human communication. So as humans, we're all created very uniquely, or, we all have our different preferences and so forth. However, we strive to create a sense of belonging to other individuals, right? We could even take into consideration Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where, one of the basic human needs is having a sense of belonging, right? So how do we belong to a particular group? Well, we have to identify with a particular group. So this is all about Burke's theory of identification. So according to Burke, the second theoretical assumption is that persuasion is more complicated than solely just communicating an explicit intentional message to a specific audience. So the authors of our textbook also, explain this in the very first sections of the textbook, where it's like, how do we even define persuasion, right? And that in of itself is can be quite challenging, because is persuasion an explicit intentional message directed at an audience? Not necessarily. We could be persuaded indirectly through this process of identification. So this is what Burke is getting at, is persuasion is more about identification, creating shared group meaning and cohesion. So let's go ahead and talk about ostracism and persuasion. So ostracism is the perceived exclusion from a society or group. So what implications does that have on persuasion? Well, we could take a look at Noelle-Neumann's spiral of silence theory to explain why this is, right? So the basic theoretical assumptions of spiral of silence theory by Noelle-Neumann are as following. People have a natural and unconscious fear of social isolation that leads to monitoring signs of approval and disapproval. So whether we like it or not, we have a natural, unconscious fear of being excluded from a group, whether that's being excluded from our family unit, whether it's being excluded from our class or our college or society, and so forth. The second is public opinion is shaped by popular opinion. So the prevailing opinions in society are often shaped by what's just popular, not necessarily what's right or accurate for that matter. The third is perceived approval correlates with willingness to voice opinions. So if you share an opinion that aligns with prevailing popular opinion, you're going to be more willing to share openly about that opinion. The next theoretical assumption is that perceived disapproval correlates with refraining in an attempt to avoid social isolation, ostracism, rejection, criticism, or disapproval. So if you have an opinion that diverges from the prevailing popular opinion, you're less likely to voice that because of this fear of judgment, social isolation, rejection, criticism, disapproval, and so forth. So people who perceive their opinions as unpopular are more likely to engage in silence. And so this is where we get that the title of the theory, spiral of silence. Opinions essentially spiral down into silence. So subsequently, dominant opinion is reinforced, and less popular opinions are oppressed. So here's a diagram that visually depicts the spiral of silence theory. So because we have this fear of isolation, and if our opinions, beliefs, behaviors, and so forth go against public opinion, if there's perceived discrepancy, our willingness to speak out slowly diminishes and decreases to the point that we essentially silence ourselves. So you can just take a look at the serious implications this has. Public opinion is not always right. It's not always accurate, but maybe we silence ourselves because we don't want to speak out against what the prevailing opinion is because of fear of this isolation. Okay, let's go ahead and get into section 3, getting lost in the crowd. The book talks about this de-individuation process, and this is a process in which individuals in a large crowd loses a sense of their personal identity in groups. And so there are really two things that lead to this process. First is group size increases individual anonymity and decreases inhibitions in self-awareness. So this is that process where individuals lose their sense of identity. They lose a sense of self-awareness, primarily because they're lost in the crowd or just another face in the crowd. They feel maybe more emboldened in their behavior. So you think of the positive benefits of being in a large group. So you think of maybe music festivals, and one of I think the thrills that most people experience is this process of losing a kind of a sense of yourself. It's kind of liberating. So music festivals are very popular. We often see this taking place. Another condition that happens in this process is this emotional contagion, which increases the arousal level people experience within that group. However, if we take a look at emotional contagion, this is the idea that emotions can be transferred from one person to another. This transference of emotional states can have some serious implications. It could also increase impulsive behavior, irrationality, and also extreme behavior. This is, some people call this mob mentality, where we see oftentimes riots or even peaceful protests turn extremely violent and destructive because of this de-individuation process, where again people lose a sense of themselves. They feel like they're just one in a large group. Their inhibitions to control their behavior decrease, self-awareness decreases, and we see that increase in arousal, that transference of emotional states, impulsive, irrational, and extreme behavior. So the book talks about all sorts of different examples that illustrate this. One of those is the bystander effects, where in a large group, if someone needs help, chances are people aren't going to offer help because they assume someone else is going to do it, or they don't want to go against the group. So it's really, really crazy to think that in moments of crisis, if the prevailing group is doing something, most of us are just going to follow along. So this has been a brief presentation overview of Chapter 6. Obviously, you would want to read deeply in the chapter to get a deeper understanding of how group conformity, norms, and group influence relate to persuasion and influence, again, our attitudes, our beliefs, and our behaviors. But in this presentation, we briefly covered norms, conformity, and group influence. We briefly talked about ostracism and persuasion. And in section 3, we talked about group influence and decision-making outcomes. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.